right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Welcome to Development Discourse, where we ideate for Africa's development. My name is Patrick Okigbo, founding partner at Nextier. Nextier is a multi-competency advisory firm focused on solving Africa's complex challenges. Despite Africa's rich resource endowments, the people are poor. About 40% of Africans are extremely poor, while the governments continue to seek ways to grow the economy and improve livelihoods. It must also address the needs of people who are already stuck in the poverty trap. My guest today, Julie Kedroske, will discuss these issues with me on how to build effective social protection programs. Julie is a director of social protection program at Innovators for Poverty Action. Before joining IPA, she served as the head of technical assistance for BRAC's Ultra Poor Graduation Initiative, where she oversaw a global team providing technical guidance and policy advocacy support to governments, multilaterals, and NGOs across Asia and Africa on adopting and scaling graduation programs. She has over 10 years of experience in program development, technical assistance, and capacity strengthening. She specializes in designing and implementing integrated development programs, including social protection, livelihood protection, financial inclusion, and social empowerment. Julie, welcome.
Thank you so much, Patrick. What a pleasure and a privilege to be here speaking with you all today. I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Fantastic. And I think, maybe the way we start is for you to make some opening remarks, maybe a presentation, and then we'll spend some time exploring those issues. So over to you, Julia.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I did prepare a few slides. I'm happy to run through them rather quickly. I thought for those who weren't familiar with Innovations for Poverty Action, or IPA, it might be nice to introduce the work of our organization. IPA is a research and policy nonprofit that was founded in 2002. Our vision broadly is more evidence and less poverty. And we've structured our strategic ambition, which you see here, around improving lives by discovering and advancing what works. So we're really looking to address two key problems we see in the global space: is the lack of rigorous evidence, and the fact that when this evidence does exist, it's often not necessarily used or utilized to its fullest extent. So to achieve our mission, we've developed these three ambitions, or three pillars, based on our experience and what we see as some of the key challenges in the evidence path to scale and to adoption. So the first is creating stronger evidence, to deepen knowledge on how to reduce poverty, to share it strategically, to influence conversations, discussions, similar to what we're having today. And then the third and final is to really equip decision makers to use that evidence, right? Being a partner in those discussions and helping to tailor and contextualize global evidence to a particular context. IPA, as of this year, is present in 20 countries across the world, with active research projects in over 30. So we have a widespread, a variety of partners that we work with. It really relies on strong partnerships and long-term country presence in areas where we operate, and just only serves to increase the research quality when we have deep relationships with key stakeholders. I will mention IPA Nigeria, which is our newest operation that was started in 2019. I have a brief here and happy to share a link after the presentation, but share some examples of our work to date in Nigeria and insights into sort of critical issues that affect livelihoods and people experiencing poverty. So it's a wide variety of sectors that my amazing colleagues at IPA Nigeria support. It includes education, consumer protection, financial inclusion, peace and recovery, as well as social protection. So there's a lot of exciting work happening there that I encourage you to take a look at. Today's discussion, of course, will focus on social protection. So happy to share a bit more about what that looks like at IPA and what the portfolio of our research entails. So we partner with governments and other implementing partners working to move households out of extreme poverty by creating economic opportunities for the poor, right? We help governments and other stakeholders identify the most effective solutions, the ones that they can afford, and the ones that have some political will to be advanced. So we take on portfolios that we know have promise for scale, and we have some existing research that we've been able to do that with this successfully. So that includes cash transfer programs, which we'll talk about today, graduation programs, as well as jobs training. For some who maybe are less familiar with social protection, we can do sort of a basic definition, right? So it's a wide variety of programs, many of which most of people in the audience would be familiar with, but they're programs that aim to help individuals cope with crises and shocks, to find jobs, to invest in their children's education and health, and to protect aging populations. So if you think about sort of protective and promotive support across individuals' life cycle, right? There are different periods of time or life events where you would need additional support. It also helps to both improve the lives of people experiencing chronic poverty, as well as help prevent from falling back into sort of cycles of poverty or the poverty trap. While there are a whole host of different instruments within social protection programs, we're only going to focus on a couple, but this slide demonstrates the wide variety that we have, right? So cash transfers, both in kind or in physical cash or digital cash, as well as things like disability benefits, maternity benefits, social insurance programs, public works. It really does run the gamut of different instruments. But we'll focus our discussion today on the global evidence that IPA and other researchers have contributed to around cash and multidimensional programs like graduation. I think this slide is just sort of frame mine and Patrick's discussion for later on in the webinar around some of the key challenges implementing social protection, right? These are faced by any government in any country around the world, challenges with program financing, with design and effective delivery of these really complex programs that are looking to really sort of break that poverty trap in multidimensional ways. Low and middle income countries experience these challenges and more, right? There's an even more restricted fiscal space for social protection programs, a lower tax collection to GDP ratio, as well as constraints to borrowing that make it even more difficult. There are also increasing challenges with targeting, given large informal sectors within low and middle income countries, limited or reduced information sharing as well in terms of accessibility for enrollment. And then delivery challenges are compounded with weaker institutions, more incomplete markets. There are a number of dynamics that make this hurdle even larger. So I was hoping I'd take a few minutes just to review the evidence of cash transfers and graduation programs and some of what we're seeing come out of this research in terms of design and delivery, key considerations or recommendations for different partners. So the first is on cash transfers. So since the 1990s, we've learned an enormous amount about the impacts of cash transfers, right? There are over 300 studies and counting around the world on these instruments and their impacts. So it's been thoroughly researched. And of course, in the aftermath of COVID-19, we're seeing even more interest in amplifying the reach and the evidence of these programs as a response to the pandemic. Here are some of, I think, the basics. I think most people are familiar with cash or voucher assistance, food aid programs. So here's a bit of the research on, a review of food aid programs in low-income countries that found that they reliably improve nutrition and may have reduced poverty for some beneficiaries, right? So it is a useful instrument when targeted to nutrition and health benefits. Food vouchers, so in-kind food, similar, or vouchers like food stamps, can have impacts when distributed at a lower cost, depending on the market realities. So that can also be an effective tool. The caveat here is that food aid and vouchers are efficient when food is available at local markets, right? So it's preferable when markets are working well and there's accessibility to those products. There's little evidence that food aid or vouchers are resold or used or purchased for temptation goods. I think that's often a misconception of cash assistance in general, that it would be then used for vices or not used for the intended purpose of smoothing consumption or supporting household welfare. Even more evidence on cash. We're seeing cash generally reduces rates of intimate partner violence across the globe in many studies. Positive effects for both conditional and unconditional cash transfers. Unsurprisingly, conditional cash transfers tend to move the needle more on the conditions in which they're looking to serve, right? Things like health care access and education for children. A review of 19 studies of cash transfers found that the program did not increase spending on temptation goods, similar to vouchers and other cash assistance. I think there are two foundational caveats to put to some of this cash evidence, however, that most cash transfers offer very small or modest amounts of support, although consistent, but doesn't necessarily encourage households to experience this more transformative change of overall poverty, right? They're small, consistent transfers that are looking to smooth consumption within a household to ensure that they're not diverting some of those resources away from the household in a way that would sort of harm the overall welfare, right? And then quality of targeting and enrollment really varies widely within social protection systems. It's difficult to avoid both inclusion and exclusion errors, and we can talk about that a little bit more later on in the program. But there are different tools or different instruments given the context and objective of these programs, but certainly some challenges on the design and delivery side. IPA has recently completed a series of briefs diving into more recent research from 2016 onward that unpacks some of this design and delivery, some of these challenges, right? So we go more specifically into not does this work, but how do each of these mechanisms affect impact for cash transfers? So I'm happy to provide a bit of an overview here. The studies in the series of briefs look at the amount or the value of the transfer and its impacts on outcomes, the payment mechanism, the duration and frequency of those transfers, as well as whether or not it's a cash or in-kind transfer. And there are some highlights or key takeaways that we've distilled from that evidence. The first being that higher value transfers can have a greater impact on things like consumption, savings, investment, and health and nutrition outcomes when it's provided as sort of a lumpier one-time payment or as a cumulative benefit over a fixed time period. So there is some transformative effect around a higher value investment given to a household, and you'll see that also in the graduation research. And then when comparing either to high value or low value transfers to one another, the higher relative value transfer also produces stronger impacts on economic indicators, things like investment and consumption. There is this misconception that cash transfers then create a disincentive for work, and that's not borne out in the evidence base, so that it does encourage choice. So individuals that are receiving this transfer have a bit more freedom to choose, that they could be substituting wage work for care, self-employment, moving into more entrepreneurial activities, or supporting education for their children. And we're also seeing that the value of the transfer varies by gender. So in some instances, there are potentially negative effects, of course, around abuse, empowerment, and safe sex, but it really depends on the demographic and the context. So there's some more work to be done there around adaptation and focusing specifically on gender-inclusive programming in cash. The next is around duration and frequency. So certainly found it within the research that impact varies based on duration, looking at those distributed over a longer period of time, 24 months and beyond. This allows for more predictability associated with greater impact. There's more sort of comfort in knowing that transfer will be there, and that they're able to invest in things like children's health, nutrition, education, or even employment and labor opportunities. So certain benefits to longer duration. It can also increase risk tolerance, right? So we see that with households being able to plan for the future, to sort of reduce their inhibitions around maybe more riskier investments when it comes to their own income generating activities or entrepreneurship. This could lead to more profitable income generating activities as well if they're feeling more comfortable to take a bigger bet. Universal basic income can benefit children, especially when it's timed to particular developmental periods in a child's life. Certainly the first 1,000 days being some of the most impactful time periods for those cash transfers to see outcomes within households. And then frequency is the other. So there's limited information or evidence around frequency really being a key driver of impact in these instances. There is more evidence around frequency combined with other elements like value that do produce impacts, particularly around gender. So the frequency and the amount, perhaps giving women a greater ability to control cash, but more rigorous evidence is needed on how those dynamics really play off one another. And then in general, the one-time transfer may be preferable for policymakers. It's it's a bit simpler and more cost-effective in some ways to do a one-time transfer as opposed to smaller, frequent transfers over time. And the last two elements I'll mention are on the modality. The research in the review didn't come forward with a superior model. I think there are strengths and weaknesses to all methods, again, depending on the objective and the context, but that cash transfers do appear to be more effective than in-kind transfers or vouchers for improving a range of those outcomes that were studied. Of course, in-kind transfers are more costly than cash transfers, so it may limit their potential for scale for certain stakeholders, and certainly more evidence is needed around other outcomes. A lot of this research is focused on food security, health and nutrition outcomes, not as much on sort of consumption, income, and even more downstream impacts like mental health. And then payment mechanisms themselves, we can talk about, I think we will talk about in the discussion around leveraging digital technologies and how we see that happening, particularly with cash transfers as a cost-effective method, with a major caveat around sort of the strength of the ecosystem and infrastructure for those digital transfers, right? Thinking about mobile coverage and saturation, digital literacy, access barriers, particularly for women, access to bank accounts and IDs is a key consideration when thinking about digital transfers. And I'll move us sort of quickly to graduation programs as another promising social protection approach that is being implemented in Nigeria and being tested. This is an example of a program that really seeks to amplify the effects of things like cash transfers and often builds off of existing cash transfers or integrates some form of consumption support. And this is by adding on livelihood training and mentorship to really help individuals, extreme poor individuals, access and income generating activity, really leverage and expand that work to support the overall resilience of their household. This is a graphic that details the general sort of standard model of graduation, which starts with some more participatory targeting approaches at the community level, a market analysis to understand what are the available livelihood opportunities within this context, and then a carefully sequenced and timed set of interventions that runs from anywhere from a year to 2 years or more. So this is the life skills coaching, which happens direct mentorship with a coach, an asset transfer, which historically has been either livestock, but is now more commonly cash transfers that are used for a variety of income generating activities, with some accompanying technical skills training to support that asset and income generation, consistent savings support in the form of savings groups and access to financial products, and then, of course, this consumption support, which is oftentimes pre-existing cash transfers. IPA has supported the rise of graduation to one of the most rigorously evaluated anti-poverty programs with randomized evaluations. You can see here this is the initial 6-country replication. This was born out of Bangladesh there in the pink. It was pioneered by BRAC in 2002, is really exploded over the last 20 years, right, with the number of implementing partners and number of stakeholders engaged. And part of that is really this proof of concept research that was developed to say this works outside of Bangladesh. We see evidence of impact across a range of contexts and a range of implementers. So here you had NGOs implementing, governments implementing, microfinance institutions as well, and showing these effects really. After 3 years, statistically significant impacts in 8 out of the 10 key outcomes, strong positive and sustained impacts despite differences in markets, in cultures and subsistence activities, showing sort of the power of a multidimensional response to extreme poverty. A caveat here is that graduation, while effective, is expensive, right? But most of this research in terms of the cost-benefit ratio, especially from this Journal of Science study that was published in 2015, the global average cost-benefit ratio was 166%. So although it is a large upfront investment, it really is worth the benefit in the long run. And we see that borne out in some of the longitudinal evidence that we have from BRAC's program, with evidence at the 11-year mark, and in India at the 10-year mark, showing sustained gains across a range of outcomes. So certainly working well in those contexts. Ethiopia, still some support and outcomes of being improved, but the difference between those that received the programs and those that didn't is becoming smaller over time. So still some work around adaptations for different contexts to be done. But this graphic is not the impact by poverty level, but a distribution of outcomes. So just to say that graduation is a proven approach, but there's still more that can be done in terms of the design to make sure that those at the bottom 10th percentile are still receiving the kinds of benefits, right? So there's more that we need to understand about the particular challenges of sort of the heterogeneity within this population that's receiving the program, so we can tailor that design. And so this is where the research is heading, right? We've been studying this work for 20 years. We have a research agenda to better understand now that this is a proven concept, and particularly governments are interested in adopting the approach. What have we yet to learn? What are important key questions on the path to scale? A lot of that is, what do we remove? How do we make it more cost effective, right? And there are plenty of examples here of programs that have looked at paring down or streamlining this intervention, what's necessary and what's not in terms of these key components. So in Ghana, they tested just the asset only, savings support only compared to this full program. Turns out the asset is quite important. And having more holistic support is really needed. So the asset alone doesn't work, savings alone doesn't work. A more coordinated support is necessary. Other groups are testing lower cost versions that are shorter in duration, that remove the consumption support, that provide more intensive or accelerated support, and they're seeing similar outcomes to the full program, which is encouraging. Similarly, the BOMA program is also a lower cost graduation that looks at group-based livelihoods, so including 3 women in one group enterprise, so they share the responsibility, sort of the time burden of that income generating asset, but also are able to share caregiving responsibilities, right? So leveraging the impacts of a group-based livelihood. And then in Uganda, they were testing group coaching versus individual coaching, and also an arm where they provided no asset. Again, assets seem to be critical in these contexts, is what the evidence is bearing out, but that group and individual coaching had nearly similar or nearly identical impacts. So a 13% decrease in the cost of facilitating group coaching is a key lesson moving forward for cost effectiveness of this model. And then some of the other things that implementers and stakeholders are thinking about adding, right? As we come to better understand these populations that are being served, there are key barriers that are useful to focus on, one of them being psychosocial support, right? So in Malawi, they're testing gender-sensitive graduation with couples training, so engaging men and spouses in the life skills training in particular. In the Sahel, in their adaptive social protection program that's run by government, adding psychosocial support, adding community-based gender training, which is the image you see on the right, video-based community-wide sensitization around gender empowerment and women's rights. In Ghana, they're testing out cognitive behavioral therapy and men's engagement in DRC as well. So a heavy focus on reducing psychosocial barriers. And then in Kenya, trying out the intersection of sort of climate and social protection, right? We see the extreme poor being remarkably vulnerable to climate shocks and needing support and resilience in those areas. So they're looking at greening systems, greening value chains, greening the livelihoods, and community support for conservation as a key area of adaptation. And this is just to sum up a bit of the broader research agenda, right? How do we do this more cheaply? What are the add-ons? How do we leverage technology, both in terms of coaching or delivery of assets? What are these key questions for scale? IPA has a research agenda on this next wave of graduation, which I'm happy to share, that unpacks these component pieces a bit more. But I think there are a lot of correlations between where the graduation research sits, where cash transfer research sits, a lot of the similar questions around scale. That's it for the presentation.
Thank you for that presentation. And just to say to our participants, we're going to share the presentation with everyone, and anyone who visits later the YouTube channel, will find a link to the presentation. But Julie, let me just start from the end and then we'll walk through. So a politician in a typical African country, you're faced with massive poverty. The easiest thing to do, the most visible thing to do, is take trucks load of food, come into the community, distribute the food, and everyone is, says, oh, the politicians are doing what they should do. How effective is that versus creating a social protection program that provides, hopefully, longer-term sustainable solutions?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's certainly endears some individuals to sort of that political act of food. I think that the issue here and what's important to reflect on is the sustainability of impacts, right? Of that safety net of a social protection floor, right? Some essential guarantees for all citizens to be able to access healthcare, income support for children, access to benefits for elderly and people with disabilities, right? It's a short-term view versus a long-term view, right? And how sustainable those supports are. Yeah.
And obviously, creating that program takes a lot of resources, a lot of effort, and which the politicians may not have. So how do I make that argument with a politician, right? How do I convince them to go down this path and that this is a lasting solution, especially as the research in some places says maybe the program had an effect or not? Yeah. How do I more convincingly or more conclusively convince a politician that this is a path to follow?
Yeah, I think that is the evidence adoption argument, right? There's an overwhelming amount of evidence. I think also seeing the program in action is really helpful for stakeholders, since there are a lot of regional events and fora where they can better understand as a pure government, as they're implementing it, how it's done, what are the challenges that they're facing, but also what are the benefits, right? I think the benefits are multifold. And also long lasting. So when implemented and implemented well, you have these longitudinal benefits that last 10 to 12 years and are really seen to change intergenerational poverty within a household. So I think those arguments can be really persuasive, and they're evidence-based, which is, even better and more sustainable.
Exactly. And for a country like Nigeria, Botswana, all these countries in Africa, how do you begin to design these programs? Walk me through maybe a step-by-step, even if it's high level. How do we begin to conceive it? What do we do? Especially given that in many of our countries, we don't have effective ways of identifying, or targeting who should benefit.
Yeah, in my past life, when doing technical assistance on graduation, it always started with a feasibility assessment, right? Not every partner is going to be in a position to implement an intensive and dynamic program like graduation right off the bat. So it's understanding what is working now, what's happening on the ground that can be leveraged. A lot of this work is about convergence, right? It's not about creating and building a whole new program. It's about saying what exists here, what can we leverage or link into, how can we create referral mechanisms, with the understanding that there's sort of a broad conceptual framework that is graduation, right? It should be multidimensional. It should help people in 4 key areas, right? Access to social protection, access to livelihood support, access to financial inclusion, and social empowerment. Whether or not that's existing programs that we're then bringing together and converging, or something that needs to be sort of built from scratch, but always with a feasibility study to say, are you at a position where this is feasible financially in terms of capacity, what needs to be built within a government system to take on this kind of dynamic program, to monitor it, to build evidence. And also, I think, the targeting piece is really critical as well. The graduation program in particular, a lot of this research has been built on more participatory community-based targeting approaches, right? Now more and more as governments are taking on, it's both the cash transfer registry with additional community level verification or validation of those targeting mechanisms. So in an ideal world, these definitions of who's the poorest within these communities who should be eligible is a community-based definition, right? The registry is not as dynamic to be able to make those distinctions, but is a useful sort of basis in terms of looking at income poverty in particular. But yeah, more dynamic methods are necessary.
Yeah. And so there are some arguments against the effectiveness of social protection programs, right? And these arguments range from how do you target the beneficiaries to do you actually effectively graduate people from the program, right? Or do you create dependencies where you've got folks who then stay on in the program for as long as the government can sustain it? Can you provide some evidence where folks have passed through such programs and exited the poverty trap and can then support themselves? And what are the elements that made those programs work?
Yeah, and I think it's a great question. I think part of it is understanding the purpose and the objectives of social protection, right? It's not always that you no longer need it. It's a right that you should be able to avail of if ever you should need it. And oftentimes we go through periods in life where you need additional support, where you find yourself without a job, a family member has fallen ill. So the idea that you would sort of exit a need for social protection is a little bit of a misnomer, right? Everybody should be able to avail and have the right to access social protection. For the extreme poor, I think it's important to think of particular objectives and context for those individuals, right? A one-off single instrument cash transfer may not be the transformative sort of tool to raise their incomes to a point where they're self-sufficient, where they're able to provide for their family or have a degree of resilience, right? That may look like more of a graduation program where it's integrated, it's multidimensional, it's supporting a variety of challenges that a household is experiencing at one time. So certainly there are examples of where this isn't working well, where there's targeting errors of exclusion or inclusion, where there's corruption issues. I think a lot of that is that social protection systems need time to grow and mature and build that capacity. It's not something that really happens overnight, and there are very contextual sort of specific challenges that need to be addressed related to the particular populations you're serving in the context in which you're delivering them.
How do we even make the argument to push social protection programs in a country where probably half of the population are in extreme poverty? Where it appears that everyone's poor, 50% are already in extreme poverty. The country itself is not as physically stable as it used to be. How do you push this argument that it's the right way to help people who are already stuck in that poverty trap to kind of exit or have some way of existing?
Yeah, I mean, in my mind, it's one of the only answers, right? In order to gain and improve resilience for these populations, they have to be able to feel like they have a net, right? In order to make riskier investments, in order to support the health and well-being of their families, having sort of a sustainable safety net is part of building a greater prosperity for that group. And so I think especially thinking about adaptive social protection, more shock responsive social protection, things like income and inflation spikes, the subsidies that are happening now, being able to have an instrument like a shock responsive cash transfer program really allows for growth and allows for sort of a future mindset there that helps large swaths of the population. And I think we're in discussions around the design of a graduation program, particularly for youth in Nigeria, understanding how unique the situation of youth unemployment is in the country and what those unique challenges are and how they could be designed for within the context of a graduation program.
Can you share more on some of the work you're doing in Nigeria, and what you're seeing and what some of those key considerations are on what elements should be part of the Nigeria program?
Yeah, and some of this is early stage work, but particularly for the youth, and we've seen this in other youth-focused graduation programs around the globe, it's a mobile population. They're not necessarily interested in agrarian income-generating activities, more market-based activities. It's harder to program for the livelihoods piece for those individuals, but a worthy challenge to address, right? Thinking about how you better understand market dynamics, regional market dynamics, opportunities for what we call a more sort of varied livelihoods menu with primary and secondary livelihoods, something that can generate income more quickly and something that takes a little bit longer to mature and to invest, but can provide a sort of a nest egg for a household and something more reliable and more resilient to shocks long term. So I think a lot of the interesting work is around how we figure out the livelihoods piece for youth, but also around the targeting, who within the household is sort of best positioned to be the primary recipient of a graduation program. That can vary based on the demographics of the household, also the likelihood of youth migrating for work, taking that into consideration as a positive economic migration in some instances, and how do we sort of support or encourage that while also supporting the overall welfare of a household.
So one of the challenges we face in the country today is just almost near complete depletion of trust in public officials, politicians, the government, etc. So it's difficult for Nigerians to agree that some level of intentionality went into the targeting
Sure.
of the beneficiaries, or to even prove that the beneficiaries are the deserving beneficiaries. how do we walk us through how this targeting is done, to bring a little bit of comfort that it is not just people picking their friends and family to benefit, but that there's some level of rigor that goes into it.
Yeah, and targeting is tricky. I think every country everywhere is struggling with similar challenges, right? Around the transparency of these processes, what's most effective. Inevitably, you will include and exclude people erroneously, right? That happens to some degree, which is normal. But I think targeting methodologies really vary from sort of categorical, geographic or demographic targeting practices to more welfare-based, where you're seeing things like proxy means testing, proxies for a local definition of poverty and welfare in those contexts. And so I think the most successful programs use a combination of all, right? There's a combination of more softer information or community-based targeting methodologies with a PMT, with some categorical targeting methods. This is all based on the fact that it should be transparent and there should be really strong grievance and redress mechanisms, so that if there are feelings of corruption or things that have been implemented incorrectly, that there are areas or ways, mechanisms for redress in that space. But specifically for graduation, the project built in Bangladesh, it's community definitions, right? So they make the definition, they physically put households in each of these sort of buckets to say, compared to myself, my neighbor is worse off and therefore would benefit more from the program. So it's really communities buying in at that level. And I think that goes for all social protection instruments in general, right? You need a community level buy-in, you need local government especially to buy in and be transparent about their involvement and their support for communities at that level.
Interesting. Can we speak a bit about affordability? Again, in an earlier question, I spoke about a country that's half of the population is poor. The country itself is getting poorer. It's not making as much money as it used to. How do countries fund these programs, right? And where can you go for help? How do you make that pitch to be able to access the support needed?
Yeah. This is also a good question. Most social protection programs in higher income countries are obviously tax revenue based, right? They're based on tax contributions. For lower income countries, that's of course not as readily available. With more informal economies, the tax base is more limited. So that's not necessarily an area that could be drawn upon within the immediate future. I think this is a much longer term view for creating sustainable tax revenue to be pulled from. With that said, within existing budgets, it's also important to look at how much is being dedicated towards social assistance as opposed to other programming. What is that mix and how could it be shifted? Recognizing how foundational social assistance is to all of those other areas, right? Advances in health and education in particular, which tend to have a larger portion of government budgets than perhaps social assistance. So there's, I think, some messaging there that could be used to maybe have a more equitable split in supporting social assistance. But without those two, the third is looking at donors, right? Looking at aid flows and how you capitalize on particularly the attention that cash transfers have received after COVID, the sort of spotlight that's on social protection systems and their growth and development as the first layer of defense against epidemics, large-scale shocks, natural disasters, et cetera. So I think that there's scope to sort of encourage more aid at a global level to support social assistance. I also think one of the important areas to look at is that nexus of climate change and social protection as a key area where a lot of funding is being driven more recently, in understanding that preventing loss, shock responsive, early detection or early warning transfers, all of that can be seen to support more climate adaptive and mitigating measures within our increasingly sort of polycrisis climate change world. Yeah.
And are you seeing any new innovative thinking around sustainability? So let's assume that governments figure out how to create and fund these programs. Are you seeing any great ideas on how they're also thinking about how to sustain the program going forward? Here I'm thinking, are you beginning to see any marriage between the social protection programs and like impact investors, who are focused on driving social benefits at the grassroots level, so that as people are kind of exiting the poverty trap, they are getting livelihood support of some sort, starting businesses or something that then makes sure that they don't fall back into the poverty trap. And you notice that I'm really focused on people who are stuck and how to get them out, versus just having availability of the program that is accessible to anyone. Because that's the real problem I think we're facing on the continent today.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think there are some sort of at a higher level innovative financing mechanisms that a lot of NGOs are tapping into to better understand how we sustain these programs at scale. But to your more specific question around those that are trapped in sort of this this big push that perhaps gets them over that hump where they're not as susceptible to falling back. I don't know that there's been a lot done on sort of that small and medium enterprise level of like major inflections of cash to be able to sustain or grow enterprises at that level. I think that's a critical question for scale. A lot of these programs are around entrepreneurship or self-employment, really small scale businesses that are sort of growing over time, but not larger sort of community-based or linking into regional value chains and things like that. I think that's a really important question around market dynamics and sustainability long-term for larger enterprises. But yeah, I don't see as much of that in the graduate students.
Obviously, there are different, and you touched on it in your presentation, there are different types of social protection programs that a government can consider. My first question is, are there some of those that you have found that the data shows consistently are better than the others? And here I'm thinking like conditional or unconditional cash transfers, even the universal basic income that's been tried in some places like Finland, etc. Are there some of these that you're finding to consistently show better causation and stronger correlation?
Yeah, certainly there's a UBI study that IPA supported in Kenya with Give Directly, which is a longitudinal study over 12 years that tested a couple of different versions, right? They all received the same amount in the end, but some were lump sums, some were smaller monthly payments, and some were over this 12-year period. And still finding
UBI?
Yep, UBI.
Okay.
And still finding strong impacts on consumption and income to some degree. I think that the trouble is the objectives of each of these programs are often not the same, or the key outcomes they're looking to measure. So for instance, looking at conditional or unconditional cash transfers, conditional cash transfers have a very specific outcome they're looking to impact, right? Often it's school attendance. So I think there are effective methods. I think there's plenty of research to suggest that those are useful tools, but sometimes it's apples and oranges in terms of comparing one to the other and looking at a superior method. So I think it really does depend on the context and the objective for each of those programs.
You know, because that's the challenge, you know, again, as policy people talking to governments that may not be readily disposed to try these different things, you almost want to come in with, well, first of all, here is how to approach it, but here is the evidence on what has worked in similar situations. So my question is really looking at Nigeria, probably comparable to Bangladesh in some ways, you know, high population, you know, the different stratas in society. What did you find to be the most effective intervention in that instance? Mindful that contexts are different, but what did you find to be most impactful?
Yeah, I think those contexts are very different. I think the market realities, particularly in Bangladesh, are much different than what we see in sub-Saharan Africa, right? They're richer, they're more readily available, and so just speaking from my experience in graduation, the livelihoods interventions there, I think, are much more successful just given the strength of those markets and the accessibility. And we really struggle, I think, in implementations in sub-Saharan Africa to have that same kind of market viability for those particular programs. But yeah, I think a lot of those tools are really successful. Cash transfers, and I think there's more evidence and research being done around social insurance and agricultural insurance and other forms of micro insurance that I think are promising to keep a look on. Yeah.
Interesting. The other point that keeps coming up in these conversations is corruption, right? Are there any thoughts on how to create corruption-proof interventions, especially in societies where corruption is a big issue? I don't want to elevate it to the point of saying like it's a way of life, but it's almost a way of life. Are there tools, technology, some things that help us create corruption-proof programming?
Yeah, I don't know that I have the answer to this, but I do think that that digital technologies can be leveraged to support more transparent social protection delivery, right? So we're seeing that in digital social registries and ID systems, but also in government-to-people payments that are digital, that go directly to a bank account, that can be verified, that there are additional levels of protection on those sorts of instruments in their execution. So my only suggestion, I think, is to continue to investigate some more of digital instruments in this space.
Mm-hmm. And just to say to our participants, we'll open it up for participant questions in a few minutes. If you may, please use the Q&A tab, not the chat, but the Q&A tab, because that way it's easier to find the questions and read them out. Another point I wanted to explore with you, Julie, is capacity, right? So you create these programs in countries, assuming you've got some level of capacity at the program management level, but there should also be capacity at the local levels where you're implementing the program. To what extent, again, I don't know if you've studied this, but to what extent has program success been dependent on the level of capacity? And if the level is not at the point it should be, have you seen any programming ideas on how to solve that problem?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of the success of these programs comes down to capacity to implement at a local level, right? The quality of staff that are actually providing the benefit, providing the support, providing the training. So that does sort of bear itself out in the research to some degree. And particularly for government implementation, we know that capacity is costly. It's difficult to sort of transfer. And so there are a lot of sort of more unique delivery mechanisms that build off of NGO support, that build off of volunteer support, that sort of shadow more, NGOs typically are more nimble and they have a higher degree of technical expertise. And so there's a lot that can be learned in sort of cross-sharing and using an NGO model to sort of support the initial steps of a government taking on a more dynamic social protection program. So you see that in the Sahel with the adaptive social protection work. They have a couple of different combinations of how they sort of infuse NGO technical on-the-ground support to the delivery of those programs at different levels. And that's also in Zambia and in the Philippines. You're seeing a lot of sort of those stepping stones to building that internal capacity within government, leveraging existing technical expertise of these sort of last mile CSOs and NGOs that have been working with these populations for a really long time and understand sort of the challenges of that on-the-ground implementation.
And are you seeing any ideas on like digital payments as a way of distributing, and how effective have these been, especially in places where you don't have a banking network or financial inclusion at the last mile? Any thoughts for people who are thinking of designing these programs?
Yeah, I think it's been really successful, this government-to-people payments that are digital. And in some ways, I mean, the caveats still stand around things like data security, accessibility, digital literacy, but oftentimes this is sort of the first step to building some of that within, a recognition that this infrastructure needs to be built and sustained in order to, for instance, deliver COVID payments digitally. So it encourages and supports other actors to help those populations access bank accounts, become engaged and eligible for those programs. So I think it's a little bit of a carrot to be able to invest in some of this infrastructure for longer term gains of that digital kind of transfer.
Fantastic. Let me take a question from one of our participants. It's Wilfred Musa. He says a critical success factor of the program helps on the ability of handlers to win beneficiaries of the program. And what criteria determines who is eligible to be exited from the program? The perpetuality syndrome comes to play and poses a challenge to the program's core objective. So basically, it's a question around how do you know who's ready to be exited from the program? What criteria do you use to determine that?
Yeah, it's a really complex discussion around exit. or sort of this on-ramp. So for graduation, it was context specific, right? There were thresholds set by those that were designing the program in collaboration with participants themselves to say, at this level, we feel that there's a sufficient level of resilience that a household could sustain those impacts and continue to grow. But it's really difficult when thinking about these larger social protection instruments like cash transfers and when is there a threshold. I think it's difficult to say. I don't have a good answer because it varies based on the context, but it's I think important to recognize, as Nigeria has done, the multidimensionality of poverty and how many different factors really influence a household's readiness to sort of be exited from social assistance. So that can look really different for different households. Perhaps it's an income threshold, perhaps it's having care that really allows them to engage in income generating activities, et cetera. So I think it's a dynamic and sort of moving target on the exit question.
Excellent. I have a question from Chinelo Ugu, and it'll be interesting to see the outcome of the graduation approach for Nigeria. So I'm wondering if you have, some more insights, data to share on the Nigeria graduation program.
Yeah, so the one that we're working on has not been implemented yet, but I do know of one that the World Bank is engaging in, and I think that they are just now working on an end line. So we should have results of that program within the year. And that I think is really fascinating and will be important for the space as one of the sort of more rigorous RCT evidence that we have coming out of a graduation program there. And I believe that they were testing sort of against the cash transfer. So cash transfer plus I think some behavior change communication, and then the full graduation program, which was then varied around who within the home would receive it. And I think there was an element of choice within the household on who would receive that program. And so I think there's a lot of rich learning that'll come out of that evaluation that I'm looking forward to this year.
Another question from Valentine Achum. How do you ensure that the social protection program is sustainably rooted in the family, strengthening and child protection and welfare?
Yeah, there's a lot of work that UNICEF in particular does around child-centered and productive social protection. And so I think that there are a whole host of mechanisms to make sure that a child-centered approach, child-centered benefits, looking at caregivers and caregiver support in a more holistic way is really critical. Yeah, and I believe that UNICEF is very active in Nigeria doing exactly that.
Excellent. I have another question. They keep coming in. And this is from Emma Olori. And the question is, I'm glad you're speaking to the demographic and the peculiarity of young people and their interest in graduating out of poverty, especially outside the norms. The cash transfer model is tested and proven. The implementation will be impacted by trust in the government systems and inadequacy of a database. Are there programs or existing research that combines cash transfer with a token economy, for instance? And I guess the corruption that plagues cash transfer is a big fear, but a token economy that sits on a blockchain system may build trust and offer security and guarantee reach to the needy. So anything that we're currently doing with blockchains?
That's not something I'm familiar with. I'm happy to look into it, and I think it's an interesting idea to sort of increase the transparency and effectiveness of cash transfers. There's a lot in the financial inclusion space around cash transfers, around consumer protection, and that's a big area of focus for IPA in our financial inclusion sector. We actually have an entire initiative related to consumer protection. So I think a lot of the principles and the advancements in that space, are shared with cash transfers. But apologies, I don't have a direct response for that.
And so I keep going back to this effectiveness debate, right? On how to show almost like a one-on-one correlation between the work that's done and the results that's achieved, especially knowing the nature of the politicians we deal with and how one needs to kind of prove that an idea would work before you can convince them to even try it. Are there some examples out of Africa? I know we can speak to BRAC in the Brazilian example with conditional cash transfers. We can speak to some of the things that BRAC has done in Bangladesh, etc. Are there some Africa-specific examples that one can point to?
Absolutely, both for cash transfers and for graduation programs. We're working on an evidence synthesis that should be published in the next month or so that's looking at both of those mechanisms, more recent research over the last 10 years, and a majority of those studies are based in sub-Saharan Africa. So there are examples from Zambia, Kenya, Nigeria, I think is featured twice in there for cash transfer programs, one for a community-based graduation approach, a significant evidence coming out of Ethiopia as well. So certainly more recent evidence really focuses on testing these approaches in sub-Saharan Africa. Yeah, more than happy to share.
And we'll get those links from you and share with our participants, and also put it on the YouTube channel. But one other topic that kind of fits into the discussion is stigma, right? Where it is feared that some people might not want to access the program because of what it says about them within their communities. How real is this problem beyond what we read in the theory? In the field, how real is this problem? And then secondly, what are some of the thoughts on how to work the programs such that the stigma problem, that people are protected from feeling the stigma?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it is real, right? I think that does happen. I think there are a couple of ways to address it. I think more participatory design mechanisms and human-centered design from those that would be availing of these benefits. How do they understand and conceive of them? What are the real issues that are causing the stigma within their communities? And then it's the responsibility of those that are designing and implementing those programs to change the messaging, right? This is really a rights-based, so your right to avail of these programs. It's not really saying anything about you as an individual, or casting dispersions on where you are in life and your need to avail of these, but it's something that you really should and are entitled to. So I think it's both sort of understanding perspectives from the design and taking those into consideration in core aspects of dignity, right, in designing and communicating around those programs.
And for your specific work, right, what have you found the most challenging in designing these programs, or in convincing governments that this is the best, not the best, but that this is an effective way of dealing with poverty and all the social challenges that government's facing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there are a lot of challenges. I think even for me, I mean, coming in, I didn't have a strong research background. So I think that there's some resistance around evidence just on its face, right? Saying these are too complicated, it's not communicated simply enough. And so I think it's a task for IPA and for other research institutions in the space to make it more digestible, to say, these are the top line findings, this is how it's relevant for you in your context, and really doing our homework to understand the key challenges or barriers that those individual stakeholders are facing. Most of the time they're political, right? So how do we provide evidence that supports these political conversations, that's able to move the needle, but also encourage a greater appetite for evidence from those stakeholders at the same time?
And do you find that by providing more evidence that the political class adopts the program, or no? Because sometimes I feel that the demand for evidence is just like kicking the can down the road, oh, show me evidence, but they really don't want to do it because it's difficult work, right? It's easier to put up a few trucks and show up in a village than to design and sustain a program like this. So what's your experience been?
You have to have a champion. There has to be someone sort of at that technocrat level that believes in this evidence base, that really is committed to contextualizing it, and seeks out the right kind of support to do so. And so we've had so many government partners, ministerial partners around the world who have played that champion role, who are hungry for more evidence and for designing their own, right? They recognize the limitations of evidence from a different context. They're saying, that's great, let's take the basis and the findings and key takeaways from that, and then how do we build an evaluation that's fit for this context, built off of what we know there. So I think we have a lot of examples of success in that space. And IPA also has a function within our policy team that's called embedded labs, where we sort of embed within government ministries to help build that capacity around evidence generation and evidence adoption, so that governments themselves have that sort of capacity to engage longer term on evidence generation and decision making.
One of the challenges we confront in these parts is policy inconsistency, right? So a political party wins, maybe they're a bit more welfarist, socialist, and they put in place these programs. another political party that may be more capitalist, I guess, market facing, may say, we don't want to do it, and they junk it. Have you seen any examples from the Global South where these programs have been protected from one government to the next, and how did they do it?
Yeah, very common. I should have mentioned that as the key challenge in administrative change, when you feel like you've gotten so far with one administration with the program, and then things shift really rapidly, and you're sort of starting from square one. I think codifying into law some of these policies around these innovative approaches and social protection as a right for the population is one of the safeguards that can happen. But I think inevitably someone's going to come in and change the name, even if the program itself is the same. That there's some, just realities of being in the political arena with these kinds of tools that we have to contend with. But to the extent that they can be codified in law, this is the best protection.
And I mean, it's not a purely developing world challenge. I mean, even in the West, it's an ongoing. It might even be at the heart of the debates between the Democrats and the Republicans in America. Yeah.
And
I have a question from a John Alabi. What safeguards around the big issues of integrity of cash register, politicization of the process, technological limitations, and endemic corruption bedeviling most of the well-intentioned social protection program initiatives? What are some of these safeguards that in designing the program you put them in to ensure that it doesn't fall foul of these challenges?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, again, it comes back to transparency, to buy-in at all levels, to having some of these varied or combinatory approaches, right? So that it's some community-based interventions that are informing this work, as well as proxy means testing or some categorical targeting. So I think a mix of those methodologies, strong transparency and buy-in, especially from a local level. And then I think, again, that some of these technological innovations can also support the validity of some of these activities and safeguarding that information as well.
And I have a question from Abdulrazak Karim. Can you comment on policy adoption, or what are the challenges you've seen with governments adopting this approach? I know we've talked about it, but maybe just to bring it all together in one response.
Yeah, I mean, speaking specifically for graduation, I think we've seen a lot of government adoption, that people are running to policy to say this is an approach that we want to invest in, and the problems are really in the design after we get to that point, right? The design and implementation of that. So, but more broadly in terms of policy adoption, I think these are slow processes, right? They take some time to germinate and to sort of solidify within those ministries, and so that's a key challenge, is sort of sticking with this process in the long term to see that transformational change at a policy level.
And when you sit with, senior government officials and you're trying to push this program support, what are some of the pushbacks you get? Top 2, top 3 pushbacks, and how do you respond to them? Yeah,
the top one is that this doesn't look like my context, which is very fair. And that's the job of those providing technical assistance around this, right? Is to say, like, how will this work? What are the things that need to change in order for this to be viable in this context? Cost is the second. These are costly interventions, so making the case that it's worth the upfront investment for the longer term gains that are more sustainable. And then really, it's around sort of understanding those populations and their challenges in depth. So I think those 3 things, I think, are the most common pushbacks, that the context is very specific, the populations and their particular concerns are unique, and perhaps not fit for these kinds of tools. And then the cost.
Let's dig deeper into the second one, the cost. So the guy says, I understand what you're saying, I agree, but it's too expensive, I can't do it. How do you work with them to get to a point where they see that they can actually do it? What do you point them to? Some line on the budget, some other organization that may be able to put some money in? How do you hold that conversation?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of different ways you can approach it. I think one that's successful is looking into the future, right? Looking at the current expenditure on social protection, seeing that only growing in the future, and then thinking about making this bigger investment that really has strong impacts in a relatively short amount of time, right? Cash transfers certainly are seeing benefits rather quickly in graduation programs, which tend to be more often now just a year or 2 years, seeing that kind of transformational impact. So thinking about sort of what this bill is going to look like in the future, and these really high impact interventions that can make a large dent in in sort of the burden of those organizations in the immediate term. There's
Excellent.
a lot of work being done comparing costs of those models at the World Bank and in UN organizations. There are resources we can point them to there as well as sort of forecasting and projections on those costs.
And I know you spoke about this in the presentation, but what are scholars focusing on right now in the space? You know, what are some of the big currents? What are some of the big issues that scholars are contending with as they think about social protection programs?
Yeah, certainly cost effectiveness, looking at streamlining. So what are the necessary components? And then also this issue around heterogeneity, right? How do we design tools that are specific for unique individuals within these populations? Because not every tool is going to be useful for every individual given their circumstances. So it's sort of unpacking the component pieces and better understanding these target populations and the adaptations of this work for the urban poor, for those that are climate affected. So I think there's a lot of work and excitement around adaptive social protection, anticipatory cash transfers when we're able to use georeferencing or satellite imaging to understand when, for instance, a natural disaster or a flood is set to hit. Can we provide families with a bit of a cushion before and see how that improves their resilience? So I think there's a lot of interesting and exciting work that scholars are doing in the climate space, as well as sort of more in-depth understandings of urban poor, of refugees and IDPs, and how social protection can be a useful response.
Mm-hmm. And I have to get a question in on artificial intelligence. Are you beginning to see the use of AI in this space, and what does it look like now, and where could it go? How could AI help improve effectiveness in designing and implementing social protection programs?
Yeah, it's not a space that I know much about, but I know that there's some work that's happening more in sort of as I mentioned, like the climate space. They're using big data, using satellite imaging, using georeferencing to better anticipate some of the shocks and crises and how that may be used for the design. But yeah, certainly an area that I'm interested in learning more about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Excellent. And another question from Abdulrazak Karim. How do you align the social protection program, which are designed to address specific issues, and the emergency intervention addressing emergency shocks, such as food or health emergencies? So designed for one, but that can then be used for something else. How does that carry over?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I think that's really speaks to how robust the social registry can be, that you're able to identify individuals quickly and understand when chronic poverty is then hit with a shock, a natural disaster, and you can leverage those digital cash transfer flows to be able to top up, which is what we saw in the COVID pandemic also, to top up those benefits, to help provide additional insurance during a humanitarian crisis. I think there's a lot that could be done to continue to build out those systems in order to be able to be responsive to multiple shocks and concurrent shocks as well.
And there's a question here from Moses Ogenyi. How can longer duration social protection programs be sustained in the event of change of policy and government that affects livelihood in a country like Nigeria? How does the research team control for this shock? Beyond entrenching it in law, what else is out there that the program design team can use in ensuring that the program continues even when there's a change in government?
I think a strong monitoring and evaluation system so that you can see sort of in real time the impacts that it's having on participants, regardless of political affiliation, right? So having that data, I think, is really useful to be able to point to regardless of who's sort of administering the program. So monitoring and evaluation, RCTs or larger impact evaluations, I think, can also be used to support those conversations long term.
what are the top, I want to say top three, but maybe top one, issue that really troubles you right now about the social protection program? Globally, what's the big issue that you are contending with?
Oh, that's a tough one. I think that there are so many. I think one I've been reflecting on more recently, and maybe it's just because of, the conversations I've been having with other partners, is around inclusion and how to make social protection systems more inclusive, both in terms of gender, but also thinking about people with disabilities, children. There's, I think, a lot more that can be done to make these systems more responsive to sort of the unique situations that most of these beneficiaries are in. So I think, yeah, I'm excited about that space. It's something that keeps me up at night thinking how we can
How
be more gender responsive.
How come we haven't addressed them so far? I mean, how come the programs to date haven't really thought deeply about inclusion in that sense?
That's a great question. I wish that I knew. I think it's certainly seen as a complexity that not a lot of people understand, right? The particular dynamics of female participants in general, right? I think we're seeing a lot of this with the emphasis on childcare work, research and support in that space to understand caregiver responsibilities, to compensate for caregiving responsibilities, to create systems and support that look at a household more holistically. I think it's complicated, which is maybe why people have been hesitant to dive in, but I think it's really critical, right? I think most beneficiaries of these programs are women, and not having a strong understanding of their unique challenges, creates ineffective social protection programs in general. So
interesting. What other issues?
See, it's a lot about the population. I think about the delivery mechanisms. I think a lot of advancements can happen really quickly with the right investments in delivery and monitoring and evaluation. I think a lot of social protection programs are sort of given without a lot of data coming back around how effective they are, who they're going to, how they're being implemented. So I think a lot of the capacity building support is something that I'm focused on also. How do we better support governments to learn from their own operations and be able to engage in adaptive management, to shift and alter these programs more nimbly to respond to unique challenges that they're facing on the ground.
Interesting. And is there a question that you thought I would ask that we haven't covered?
I don't know. We touched on technology. I think it's quite interesting about funding. I don't know, maybe I'd like to hear more from you about what you see are the key challenges in Nigeria related to social protection, and what are you most excited about or thinking about?
So I think my biggest, I've got a few challenges, but I think my biggest challenge is, number one, how we do targeting, right? Especially because we have a massive deficit of trust in government and in politicians, so how we prove to Nigerians that, number one, we're targeting and the people who are supposed to benefit are the ones who are benefiting. So that would be one challenge. Number two is how to demonstrate to Nigerians, the electorate, everyone else, that these interventions will be effective. So that if it's conditional cash transfers, if it's cash transfers, if it's some kind of a universal basic income, if it's just giving farm inputs or business support or whatever, that there's a strong correlation that shows that it's going to lead to something. And then the third is the delivery mechanism, right? To prove that there is no corruption in that system, or that we try to minimize corruption by leveraging technology, leveraging all the tools and building in all the safeguards. So those would be my top three issues, thoughts, considerations in designing social protection programs.
Yeah, I agree with all of those. I think the trust and targeting is interesting also because I think there's more and more around sort of self-targeting or electing into programs, but it requires appropriate information being shared and accessible, and also some of the institutional infrastructure to be able to validate, right? So in an ideal world, those that know they need support are able to avail of it, right? They're able to opt in and that there would be sufficient resources to validate whether or not they're eligible. So that's an interesting tactic, I think, again, needs to be used in combination with these other targeting methodologies as well.
Exactly. We didn't speak too much about M&E, but my colleague Magnus Adela has asked a question here, and what is the best way to measure the impact and outcomes of social protection programs? And I want to build on that to say, what are the challenges that we're seeing with the existing M&E frameworks that could be improved upon?
Yeah, absolutely. I think M&E capacity is always a challenge, and I think there are a lot of dynamics that contribute to that, right? Sometimes it's not focused on a particular learning question or learning agenda. These monitoring systems need to be quite robust, and there's a lot of technological innovations around sort of real-time data collection, using tablets, steering away from more paper-based monitoring so that you're able to analyze that data more rapidly and adapt the programs accordingly. So I think having buy-in around investing in monitoring and evaluation in support of the program is really critical, and then having the right support to sort of build that capacity long-term. But it also depends on what your objectives are, right? So IPA is an RCT house in a lot of ways, right? We are champions of the randomized control trial as one of the most rigorous forms of evidence that you can generate. So not every program is fit for an RCT right now. We recognize that, and there are a lot of supports that we provide around building M&E capacity to get to a point where you have a program that you want to evaluate more rigorously. But there's a lot of other learning methodologies that can be used in the interim, A/B testing, looking at monitoring data and sort of analyzing that in real time to better understand trends and impacts and challenges. So I think that there's sort of a journey that many go on, but the core objectives and whether or not you're in the position for a rigorous impact evaluation is a bigger discussion.
I have a question, maybe it's a comment from Adeni Ogini. In the implementation of social health insurance, we found that one of the critical factors in ensuring sustainability from one administration to the other is citizen education and knowledge regarding their rights in a democracy. Citizens' enlightenment and education on social protection systems is therefore imperative, as this will equip the citizens in putting this on the front burner in their considerations of who to vote for and holding successive leaders responsible for citizen social protection. And I believe he's the chairman of a forum of CEOs of state health insurance in Nigeria from 2019 to 2023. So thank you very much for joining us. I have a question, and I know it's my fault that I kind of focused too much on how do you help folks who are already stuck in the poverty trap exit the trap. But I have a question on how do you prevent people from falling into the trap, right? Are there social protection programs designed specifically to ensure that they don't even fall into the trap? And can you speak a little bit to those?
Yeah, in social protection, the theory is that it's both protective and promotive, right? So you're able to anticipate and have a floor or a net when you do experience challenges, thinking in particular about unemployment, right? You have a bout of unemployment. If you were not supported with some kind of unemployment insurance, it's likely that with no income, you would experience and sort of drop into a more pernicious form of poverty. But a lot of those mechanisms around social insurance that are embedded within social protection systems are there for particularly that reason, right? To avoid dropping in the first time when you have a shock that's visited the household in that way. But I think it's also important to recognize the holistic nature of social protection, right? Those shocks look different for different individuals, for different families, for different households. There are a lot of things, in the US context, health costs, medical costs, right? Those are one of the leading drivers of poverty in this context, is the outrageous cost of receiving healthcare. And so that's something that our social protection systems need to take into consideration when thinking about the threats to a household that may be dipping into poverty.
And I think that's a good segue to a question from Binta Mustafa. And the question is, what are the most difficult poverty traps to address using the graduation approach for social protection programs identified by IPA? And the second question is, does IPA work with other stakeholders, not just the government?
Oh, sure. Yes. Work with a variety of stakeholders. I think government's been our focus in the more recent past, just given where some of this evidence is taking us, right? They're the sort of the natural duty bearer for a lot of these programs moving forward. But a ton of our research is focused on sort of NGO implementation, working with microfinance institutions. A lot of the other sectors work with formal private sector and entities as well, with banks and other corporations. So a wide stakeholder base there. The question, remind me what the first question was. It was about the toughest parts of...
The most difficult poverty traps to address using the graduation approach. Yeah.
The graduation approach has been really successful at moving the needle on consumption, on income, and on savings in particular, and a lot of those labor outcomes. The things that have been more pernicious and difficult to address are more of those downstream secondary outcomes, things like health, mental health, self-esteem. There's some evidence around the impacts on child health and child development, but that's an area I think is really fascinating and one that a lot of people are spending more time and attention on as an avenue for that intergenerational change. So those things tend to be more difficult, or we're seeing fewer outcomes around psychosocial mental health and well-being, health, education. Those are the areas I think where a lot of the new design work and adaptation are targeting to see if we can move the needle on those pieces.
I have a slightly tricky question here from Abdul Razak Karim.
Okay.
How do you address the issues of people who have been supported to transit from poverty through conditional cash transfers as part of a social protection program, but were then further pushed into poverty as a result of government policy?
It happens, right? And I think that speaks to a design flaw for that particular individual, that case, right? There's something in the design of that program that didn't account for the particular challenges that household was facing. So I think it is a worthy question to raise and something that should be incorporated into design conversations moving forward, because there's going to be a certain part of population served that isn't receiving the full benefit, or in some way they need a different form of support, right? And we see that in some ultra poor or extreme poor households served by graduation. There are some that aren't able to actively engage in an income generating asset, right? Perhaps they really require more consistent, more robust support from government or from others that doesn't look like the more intensive and active engagement in a graduation work, right? So I think that there still is a spectrum that needs to be recognized and the right tools designed for those individuals that fall on the spectrum.
And do you see that the program managers and the government are able to redesign their programs if they find that that's the case?
I think that's the capacity we're hoping to build, right? Is that, and I've seen this even in NGO programs, that perhaps program managers don't feel empowered or have the agency to say, this is the problem and this is how I would design for it. I think BRAC is an exceptional case in the way that the ethos of learning is sort of imbued within that organization, and that the program managers do have the agency to do that, to make more real-time shifts, to say, this livelihood isn't working for you, let's try this one and let's go to that market and see how it fares. I think the government structures and bureaucracy aren't necessarily built for that, right? But that is something that could be strengthened moving forward. So I think that speaks to robust M&E and then to having that sort of agency and autonomy for local level stakeholders to make some of those design recommendations and decisions.
Fantastic. Julie, I've totally enjoyed this conversation. Any last word from you?
No, just what a privilege. I mean, thank you so much. I really am truly honored and humbled for the invitation, and what a delightful and rich discussion. And thank you to all of those that posed really wonderful questions as well.
Fantastic. And to everyone who's joined us, just know that we're going to be here again in 2 weeks with Professor Oke Ikechukwu. And the topic is From Elitocracy to Democracy. And it's going to be on August 7th, same time, to explore how we move from this domination of the elite, to a system where the votes of the people would count. So hopefully you can join us. But Julie, thanks for this conversation. I totally enjoyed it, and I hope it's the same for everyone else. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Patrick.
Bye now.